For all the years we at Lorehaven have kept up with Christian-made fantastical fiction, we have seen many authors hoping to cross over. That means they don't want to reach only readers who are Christians like themselves. Instead, they also want to influence unbelievers. And that is a great goal, to be sure. But when might our pictures of unbelievers not match with reality? Just within the last few years, has the general audience shifted so gradually or suddenly that they might now be enjoying more overt Christian-made storytelling?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
You have found Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm Steve Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven, feeling great vibes today. I'm also the author of my debut science fiction adventure novel, releasing next week from Enclave Publishing on March the 4th, 2025, called Above the Circle of Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and I am overtly a Christian. It's literally my day job, and this is episode 251. Could a cultural vibe shift advance Christian-made fiction?
Some of this could be wishful thinking, Zach, because my novel has specifically Christian characters. But I will say it's a little bit different from what people have previously associated with Christian fiction. Oh, it's preachy. It's all a bunch of prairie romances, all Amish and coloring books and things. But we're going to argue in this episode that a lot of those stereotypes are now out of date. I would venture that a lot of the potential audience for Christian-made stories now do not have this stigma about Christian-made fiction the way that some Christian authors might imagine they do.
Yeah, I think we are still in an age, and you could say we're returning to this, or it's a new golden age or whatever. But I think we're still in a culture where overtly Christian content of various kinds can still find a place among a wider audience. I think, I think Dave Ramsey is a good example of this. He's still being listened to by a lot of people who would not say that they're Christian because he's doing something valuable to them. And I think the key is just respect. I think a lot of Christian creators who create things, all kinds of things, for a wide audience, have a lot of respect for their audience, and sometimes that's all it takes.
That is all it takes. We also saw last week, Zach, a trailer release for The Chosen Season 5, which, as we've recently learned, is going to debut in theaters, and then I think from there it goes to Amazon Prime, and then from there, you finally do get it free on the app. They've had to change their distribution methods just a little bit. Again, changing with the times, changing with the expectations. You've got to pay actors, you've got to pay people, so that means that you can't just get these things for free. But that Chosen trailer on YouTube was #1, I believe, on the day of its release.
Wow.
And literally, this is a show about Jesus and about his mission on earth and about his apostles and other followers. And it is moving into the end game where it's not just Jesus doing teaching and then kind of hiding what his true purpose is for reasons, divine reasons. We are moving into the end game, spoiler alert, where Jesus is going to have a Last Supper. He's going to get arrested. He's going to be put on trial. He's going to be crucified. Then he's going to rise from the dead. And then he's going to call his apostles to go therefore and disciple all the nations. How could you get much more overt than that? And yet people are loving it. They literally got Annie Leibovitz, the famous photographer. She's done photos of subjects and people that Christians would not like very much. But it turns out that she took photos of the cast for promotional purposes. And the reason why they were able to work with her is because, at least according to the Chosen guys, turns out she was a fan of the show. So, just another example, there is something to be said for Christians doing things with excellence and respecting their audiences. No matter how overt you are, there will be an audience. But I think that there is even more an audience for these kinds of shows now. And the reason for that is what we're going to call in this episode the vibe shift. Zach and I will define that later. By the way, another example of the vibe shift is this show coming out from Amazon next week, I believe, called House of David. We're actually going to have our preview of that show next week instead of this week. And we also have a review, an on-screen feature of a little movie called Captain America, Brave New World. Marion Jacobs went and saw it. There's kind of a bit of a mid factor there, unfortunately. Maybe you liked it, in which case, either way, you'd want to read this on-screen article. We're putting out those on-screen articles a bunch at lorehaven.com, along with our weekly reviews, like the one we did for Carrie Ann Noble's new novel, The Springborn. Then next week, we're going to have a review of Above the Circle of Earth. Again, took pains to make sure that that was objective, even though I am the publisher of the site and the author of the book. You can subscribe free to get those updates. We will also send you the code to join the Lorehaven Guild. Just go to lorehaven.com and click subscribe. And speaking of Above the Circle of Earth, it does finally circle around to where that is our top sponsor for this episode. Courtesy of my publisher, Enclave Publishing, which is the top sponsor. Here's the description of this science fiction adventure releasing from yours truly via Enclave Publishing next week. The fight for the space mission begins in his home world. Brock Rivers never wanted to be a repairman on Mars. Years ago, he failed to protect his family, and now he labors across a frontier planet to keep his children alive and escape cause. But the spacefaring humanist regime is taking over Martian colonies, forcing all to join the secular state. Back in Brock's homeworld, his people summon him to fulfill old hopes with a new dream. After decades of cultural isolation, they plan to restore missions for the 22nd century, voyaging beyond Earth to share the gospel in space. Brock must find a ship and recruit a team of misfit believers. They expect opposition from the formidable cause, but not from a more deceptive enemy. One adversary attacks from the shadows to destroy the faithful. Others unify to oppose the project. Brock and his family must fight to resist these enemies of the space mission, or else return to exile forever. Enclave presents Above the Circle of Earth, a debut novel by Lorehaven Podcast's co-host E. Stephen Burnett, coming March 4th, wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or enclavepublishingstore.com. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio. You can see all those links and that fantastical sci-fi cover in the show notes for this episode 251, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast for the complete archive. Zach, I'm bringing back the concession stand, not just because next week is Above the Circle of Earth week, but because this topic requires it. We are going to, for example, mention a little bit of politics in this episode. Gasp, gasp. Now, look, listeners, I know we have a lot of great listeners who appreciate the break from all the political rancor. So do not expect rancor in this episode. We're not going to be rancorous. We're just going to mention some facts on the ground, especially within the last few months, and especially about America, but increasingly global, on the way to weightier matters. After all, a lot of people will wrongly label an issue or an idea political when it's really cultural. And this is not our fault. This is not Christians' fault. This is often the politicians' fault, because they're meddling with how people define basic things like marriage and families and religion, when they ought to be letting people figure those out. And government, however, is elected by the majority rule of the people, at least in the United States. Every 4 years or so, we get together, we elect a president. He's the only single individual that people elect all across the United States on the ballot. We also elect Congress people, senators, representatives. We also elect state governors, state representatives, state senators. We elect city officials. This is something that Christians are supposed to do. And Zach and I, by the way, keep up with these things a lot. I think we keep up with them so much just out of a casual interest, but also because we're cultural observer guys. We want to know what's going on in the world. We will debate these things. We largely agree about these things. We have a lot of friends we debate about, and it's a friendly thing. If people aren't friendly, then usually the conversation doesn't happen. We just work very hard to keep that stuff out of this podcast because it's about focus. It is absolutely about focus, but our focus on Christian-made fantastical fiction necessitates that we observe some cultural trends, which are in part also being shaped by political trends. One of those trends that we'll mention here is the vibe shift. We're going to define that in just a moment. And we'll also mention the trend, which right now, unlike the above the circle of Earth future, seems to be on the wane. Right now, secularism, it seems to be on the wane, or at least the type of secularism that Christians have been conditioned to fight. Now, if you believe my sci-fi timeline, that kind of secularism is going to be back eventually. So this is probably just a reprieve, unless you got to throw out my entire timeline. But there's some other ideas that are on the wane, and one of those we're also going to mention is what is often too generally called woke or wokeism. If you hear us mention it here, it's just a shorthand term. It's almost a meme word that generally means secular or leftist orthodoxy or tropes, okay? Secular, leftist, orthodoxy, or tropes. And I do believe this is, before a political movement, a religious movement. And once you see it, it's kind of hard to unsee it. And some people go too far and like, well, I'm going to oppose anything that is called woke, even if it's baking a nice apple pie for your neighbors down the street who don't look like you. That's not what we mean here. We do mean the bad stuff. Hopefully that helps. Before we get started, though, Zach, I want to ask you, because you, like me, are a cultural observer about these things, particularly with emphasis on Christian creativity, Christian-made fantastical fiction, and other fantastical fiction by folks who don't necessarily hate Christians or conservatives. What do you understand this term vibe shift to mean, Zach?
I think it's a change in the prevailing ideas that people are willing to accept in culture. Yeah, so just to back up a little bit to kind of what you said at the beginning there, we're not going to get into who people should vote for, and we're not even really going to talk about the politicians that got elected. Like, that's not really what we focus on. We are going to focus on what was the cultural shift that led to the election, and what is the cultural shift that's happening because of the election. Like, it's the culture that we're interested in, because politicians come and go, and politicians are very flawed people. Like, I don't spend a lot of time putting my hope in a certain politician to do a certain thing. I look at more like, what's the driving force behind certain parties or factions gaining or losing power or popularity. Not to say that like whatever is popular or elected is correct, but it's just I'm looking at what's influencing people quite a bit. And yeah, you mentioned progressivism and secularism kind of on the losing end in recent months and kind of over the last year or so. And look, that's just an observation. Like, you can't help but look at an election map and see all of the counties that flip from blue to red. Like, just go Google this. It's insane. The people that voted anyway are rejecting that. And it's interesting to look at, is it secularism they're rejecting, or is it progressivism? I think it was Bill O'Reilly years ago who coined the phrase secular progressivism as a identity label for a lot of political factions. It's unclear to me if those can even go together, because secularism is sort of the absence of religion, and progressivism is a type of religion. Like, leftism is definitely a religion, and especially when it's based on Karl Marx and that kind of framework, because a lot of that is Gnostic based, and a lot of that has nothing to do with economic theory. It's like very much a certain view of the world that presumes a lot of things about humanity. There are hidden religious assumptions in a lot of those movements, but secularism, you could say there is a religious dimension to that, if sort of a implicit one. But, what I wonder about is, are we headed into a conservative secular culture? Or again, if those are going to be incompatible with each other. And I think we're already kind of seeing some incompatibility between sort of the cultural conservative and the Christian conservative factions. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the podcast. But I think what we're seeing is just certain things that collide and try to work together, and then they can't really work together, and it creates this whole new dynamic.
Absolutely. And by the way, this episode is an incidental prequel for our next episode, in which I'll be talking some about secular humanism and what happens if you get a more conservative, quote unquote, conservative secular humanism. What sort of challenge would that be to Christians in the present, as well as a potential future? Zach, you're right that I think a lot of this gets entangled, and there's some loose coalitions or even some tight coalitions between some of the terms that I mentioned in earlier episodes, like sexualityism, that is, I think, the top threat because it is an assault on how human beings understand who they are as men and women and players in families, and the very calling of God to be fruitful and multiply, to make marriages, to make culture when you can. It attacks the very definitions at the atomic level. So I've put that in a previous podcast episode, actually, as the top threat to Christian creativity. But there are some other threats too. And I would put what people sometimes overgeneralize as wokeism as a threat. But I think it's better to refer to that by its specific parts. What do we mean by that? Well, there's some toxic empathy problems in there. We could get into that in another episode. Just know that that's what we mean when we talk about that.
Well, I think it's very simple to define it. It's the difference of equal justice under the law versus social justice.
Right.
So social justice is not interested in the rule of law, but something more like an aristocracy, like favoritism towards certain groups.
I would also put it, as a Christian, it is the ultimate expression of cheap grace. As you mentioned, Zach, about some of the Marxist ideals, it misunderstands human nature. Well, humans are basically good. It's our environment, it's our societies, it's our systems that become corrupt. The Christian, arguing from Scripture, says, no, humans were definitely made to be good. We reflect the image of God. However, we have had this whole sin incident that now poisons the human soul from generation to generation so much that the Apostle Paul calls us spiritually dead in our transgressions and sins before the arrival of Christ to bring us back to life. So how much, though, do people in a general audience resonate with these concepts? Are they still, like some Christians imagine, deceived by this whole idea of, well, everybody's basically good, and so, well, Christians need to match where they are, and even in our creative works that we need to be mindful, because that's the majority opinion, that's the general audience. How do we imagine the general audience? That's chapter 1. By we, I mean Christians who keep up with creative works like The Chosen, like Christians' fantastical fiction, like any of this. And by the way, this episode is, I think, of special interest to Christian creators. So if you're an author who wants to do this sort of thing professionally, may want to take some notes or put this one on a replay in a couple of weeks. As I mentioned at the top of the show, many Christian authors have long wanted to break out of the Christian bubble. After all, we know that, especially if we create Christian fantastical fiction, and by Christian, I mean the Christian made it, even if it doesn't have that exact references in there. If we make those kinds of stories, then we know that there's a small audience among Christian readers, folks. That's just the way it is. That's why this podcast is not, right up there alongside Joe Rogan or something. We are a niche podcast, okay? And that is perfectly okay. The niche of today may be the majority opinion of tomorrow. So that is what we're banking on. But when you go out into the wider world, they love fantastical stories. If you look at the top 20 movies, almost all of them, except for Titanic, and even that has some mysticism in it, are fantastical one way or another. So for marketing reasons alone, it makes sense for a Christian fantastical creator to say, well, I'm not just going to write for Christians. I want to make a story that's going to appeal to the general audience. And if we also have a biblical motive, as Christians should, then we also want to be some kind of witness in the world. Maybe we're not trying to get people to convert after reading our books, but we just want to be a good picture of Jesus to other humans around us. We want people to see Jesus acting, even if not teaching, in the stories and other creative works that we produce. And some of us too, especially if we feel a little weird in church or have had worse things happen to us among other Christians, we may also especially resonate with the idea of getting around other people's prejudice against Christianity. We may imagine that most of the people we meet in the general audience have had a bad experience with other Christians that was unwarranted. Maybe we have had a similar bad experience like that, an actual bad experience. But as I argued in our Church Back Home Syndrome episode, if you let that experience define you, you're going to start seeing things poorly. You're going to be blinded to what's going on in the wider world around our own biases. So if we get stuck in that bias, if we get myopic, or what I like to call ministry myopia, based on our own experiences and conversations and friend group, we're going to miss some things. We may start assuming, by the way, that most believers, not just in our world, but in all the world, share our negative views about the church. And therefore, our stories need to, maybe do something about that. They need to be better than the cheap, cheesy Christian fiction. They need to be kinder. They need to be more loving, not so nasty and not so political. Unfortunately, then, if you also mix in political tropes to a Christian who is thinking this way, then you may end up getting kind of captured, and you may end up missing where the general audience is actually going.
Okay, so I'm going to take off my podcaster hat for a minute and put on my fiction writer hat just for a little bit. So, Stephen, I don't have a book contract or a book deal coming out anytime soon, but I am writing science fiction, and I'm writing it for sort of a cultural Christian audience. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to enjoy my book. But if you're someone who hates Christianity, you probably wouldn't enjoy it just because Christians aren't the villains in my story. And maybe that's probably the biggest vibe shift I guess I'm seeing, is that so much of mainstream media has cast Christians as the villains for so long that everyone just kind of assume, oh, this is what people want. But it's those types of stories that are failing and not doing well. Even if they've got the big studios behind them, like, people are just really tired of this. And I think the most recent hilariously bad example of this was the Last of Us television show on HBO, where, spoiler alert, but this is in the game from what I understand, they meet a pastor who is not only an abuser of children, but he is a cannibal. So, wow, we got both things happening at once, like just double bad type of guy. And it was just so on the nose to just be ridiculous. And I was talking to a friend about this who said, well, at least in the game, it's kind of implied he's not even a Christian. Like he says, oh, I'm just here to take advantage of Christian. But then that's...
Yeah, they're trying to buy it back. They're trying to buy it back there, I think.
Well, and then that's an indictment on all the foolish and stupid Christians who followed him and didn't realize that he's a cannibal. Like, it's just such a dumb portrayal of Christians. Like, I'm like, has anyone ever met anyone like this? Like, I just, no one buys it anymore. Like, it's just you've got an axe to grind and that's all this is. It's not a realistic portrayal of people, And I think maybe that's part of what the vibe shift is. The vibe shift is about reality. And people are seeing that there is so much virtue being signaled and so little virtue being practiced by the signaling that so much of what we are seeing in the last couple of years has turned out to be really fake and hollow. And look, I don't think necessarily the country is totally returning to biblical Christian values. I think that a lot of those values were already there. And they're just simply being uncovered by people being more willing to speak up, and also people being less censored and suppressed by big tech and other things. There's a little bit more of an even playing field now. There's so much new media. A lot of people have said, about this past election, this is the first independent media election that candidates didn't have to rely on mainstream corporate legacy media, whatever you want to call it. That so much of this election was driven by podcasts and independent websites. And that's who is now making up a sizable percentage of the White House press corps, from what I understand. And some legacy media are being kicked out, and then they're suing the White House over this. And so that's another big vibe shift, that the independent creator is being elevated, whereas the corporate creator is being de-elevated. And we're seeing a very similar thing in publishing right now, in book publishing, that a lot of the big publishers are just not making traction in culture, or at least they're secluding themselves to a smaller and smaller echo chamber, whereas a lot of indie authors are outperforming traditional authors.
That is all fantastic points and real ones, Zach. You're right. It's about recognizing the real world. Now, what we don't mean is that, folks who believed in wokeism, as it's nicknamed, or some of these other beliefs, well, they're the minority, and they always were the minority. I'll wager that most people, the majority, are not paying attention to these things. But do they really count then? It is unlikely then that those folks even read a whole lot of books. So they're just sort of neutral players, God bless them, but they're not really part of the discussion. The discussion is about who is the loudest, who can gain the most cultural cachet, and who is getting the political power as well. And whether Christian creators and Christian evangelists, Christian ministry folks are recognizing this. There's an old joke, Zach, that Christian culture is 5 years behind, or evangelical culture is usually 5 years behind mainstream culture. Now, in some places, that is no longer true, which is wonderful to see. Christian creators, especially in visual storytelling, are leaping ahead and becoming, in many cases, the pioneers in, for example, The Chosen or House of David or the burgeoning Bible verse. That is all groundbreaking stuff. They are single-handedly bringing back the swords and sandals era that kind of died in the 50s with Ben-Hur. And it's marvelous. I mean, there's King David or future King David right there with his slingshot. I mean, that is going to be literally swords and sandals. You don't see a whole lot of swords in The Chosen, obviously, because that's not what Jesus is there to do. But it's coming back, and Christians are leading, and yet some other Christians are still 5 years behind. For example, I'm going to pick on He Gets Us again. They put another interesting ad to the Super Bowl. I think it may have been AI art again, just based on what I saw, and I don't understand that. Why don't y'all show live video footage? I don't get it. It surely can't be that expensive, but I know Super Bowl ads are not cheap, so maybe you just got to cut corners a little bit in the production department. But the big game ad, the Super Bowl ad, where He Gets Us, was posing the question, hey, what is true greatness? And Jesus gets you, and Jesus was humble as opposed to people who act great. And I wonder, really, does that message really play big for unbelievers? The kind of audience who watch the Super Bowl. And by the way, another evidence of the vibe shift, this Super Bowl was a lot more culturally conservative. At least it struck that posture. The other ads were very, very, very cultural conservative, with a few exceptions, including the He Gets Us ad. So there they are again, clapping off rhythm, particular Christians who seem to be more interested in preaching at those bad Christians than actually reaching the audience who's going to watch the Super Bowl. So that's the problem I'm talking about here, when people are caught in the past, or they're still stuck inside the church that they really haven't gotten over. And they assume that everyone else, for example, is motivated by dislike of the church. After all, most people are just kind of the same. And why would someone not want to be a Christian? It's so obvious. Jesus is Lord, and He's absolutely the best, and you ought to be a believer. Well, it's got to be because the church done them wrong, because that's the only reason I can think of. And people are basically good, so it must be their environment that made them not want to believe in Jesus. That is such a projection. That's such a narrow understanding of the complexity of actual unbelievers. They're a diverse lot. Some of them have had bad experiences with churches, absolutely. Some of them think they have, but they didn't. You've got to be discerning about it. So some are wounded, some only think they're wounded, and then some y'all are just haters. Some have joined up with false religions, and they are crusaders for the false religion. The devil is real, Satan is real, and sin is real, and judgment is real. And so Christians have got to remember that when we're dealing with our neighbors. It doesn't say, love your wounded future friends. Jesus says, love your enemies. They're your actual enemies sometimes, and yet you still got to love them. And yet, as I mentioned, some of them are not even really caring at all. They're too distracted by trivia or games on their phones. And that reminds me of Lewis's Screw Tape, who says, sometimes, Wormwood, we demons do our best work, not by putting ideas in people's heads, but by keeping any ideas or thought whatsoever out and distracting them with thoughts of whatever's for lunch this afternoon. Christians have got to catch up and I think recognize the reality of our world, which means that our understanding of the general audience could be outdated.
I just want to share one example of what you're saying. This was Naomi's aunt, who sadly passed away a few years ago. I remember when we visited her, and Naomi was like, I don't think she's a believer. But when we were talking to her, she just on her own brought up how she was really dismayed to see Christians being persecuted. And not like in other countries where it's illegal to become a Christian or convert to Christianity, but in the US. And she was really bothered by how much Christians are being, marginalized and ostracized. And then we're like, okay, did she become a Christian? And we weren't really sure. But that was a really fascinating thing to me, that she was taking the side of Christians from the outside. And she was defending the church again from the outside. And wasn't it was it Winston Churchill who said something like that, that like the best thing I can be is a buttress to the church. I may be quoting the wrong person here, but there's a famous British guy who said something like that, that he saw himself as outside the church, but he's trying to keep the walls up. And there are always people like that in culture. And there are always people that have, like you said, had good experiences, or maybe they're like, I should probably go to church again. It's like they're not going, but they kind of feel guilty about it. I think if we are missing those people, we're getting a very myopic view of culture and society, and we're missing a lot of readers of books. Like I have a good friend in mind that I was talking to about what does he like to read, and one of the things he said is, look, I like traditional gender roles in stories, and I'm like, and I think most people do. And I don't think many people believe this gender ideology stuff that's being forced on all of society in recent years, and now we find out had big bucks behind it. Lots of taxpayer money was propping this false religion up that most people didn't really believe. Like, we all know this is a lie. We all know it's a lie that a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man. That's not true. No one actually believes that. But people were feeling pressured to go along with it or sort of signal their allegiance to it in subtle ways. And yes, it's sad to see Christians not lead culture in these areas, but sort of follow culture and then be further behind, as you said. Another a tragic example of this that's been in the news a lot, there's a really good article about it from World Magazine, was Wheaton College, a traditionally conservative Christian university that had a little bit of a feather in its cap after the election when one of its alumni was elected to a high position within the administration. And they simply put out a congratulations to this individual. They said, we're praying for you. And that was basically it. They didn't say anything about this person's politics.
That is 100% appropriate. I remember when President Trump first term showed up at David Platt's church. And
Yes.
David Platt, who's often been called woke, I don't want to get into that here, but he rightly prayed for the president and then sent him on his way. And then he caught all kinds of flack for it. But that was absolutely appropriate for him to do as a preacher of the gospel.
Well, and to be fair, I think Rick Warren also got in trouble on the other side when he prayed for Obama at his church or some
also
conference
appropriate to do. Yeah.
Right, because scripture
literally
says,
it's biblical.
It's literally biblical. Pray for all of those in authority. Like,
it was written when Caesar was in authority.
Right. So whether you agree with the person who's being appointed and who he's being appointed to and what he's going to do and what his politics are, pray for the person in leadership. If you agree with them, pray he'll succeed. If you don't agree with them, pray he wouldn't. Pray that God would succeed through that person in whatever role they're in. So very tame announcement. It was apolitical how they said it. It was perfect. Well, then they got a lot of people on the left that were alumni and so forth, trashing them on social media, and they caved to this cancel culture mob. They took down their post, they issued some kind of apology, and then they kind of shut up about it. And but what's happening now is the conservative alumni are not having it. And what World is reporting is that 900 students and alumni have signed a letter to the university withdrawing their financial support until Wheaton audits all of its curriculum, professors, teachings that are straying from biblical values. And so, look, people are just not having this kind of thing anymore, where we're going to cancel someone over their politics, even when it's not a political thing. And especially when you look at this as part of a pattern now at Wheaton, is according to these students, they're saying, look, this is evidence of a drift and sort of a pandering. And again, it's, do we want equal justice or do we want social justice? Like, do we want special favors and special favoritism, or do we want to just treat everyone the same and sort of be a little more neutral? The conservative response to the progressive response, I think, is the interesting part of the story, is that everyone is speaking up now, right? Like, everyone is saying what they think. Unfortunately, Wheaton is kind of siding with one side there, but I think people are a lot bolder to say, look, we should pray for everyone in authority. Like, can we just agree on that?
So, why does this matter for Christian fans of fantastical fiction, including but not limited to Christian creators of fantastical fiction? This is why. Take some notes here, folks. I'm going to get really clear about this if I can. Lord help me. Because there's been this perception among Christian creators for so long that we've got to be careful about our public witness. And if, for example, we look too political, or we have this theme naturally woven into our stories that could feel political or feel offensive, or could trigger someone or hurt them or something like that, then we need to be careful. Well, what goes along with that perception is that this sensitivity only goes one way.
One way, yeah.
One way sensitivity. I'm not saying don't be sensitive there. That's another podcast episode. I'm saying there are different sensitivities. Now, with the example of Wheaton College, for example, what did they do? They tried to manage their public witness only one way. What did they end up doing? They ended up ruining or not doing well with their public witness with other people, other non-believers who may have been culturally conservative. It's not like it was just a bunch of Christians out there who were offended, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter what they think. We're worried about the lost. The lost come in different flavors. The lost could be leftist. The lost could be right-wing. And no matter what you do, you might offend someone. So this one-way sensitivity, we've got to get over that. We've got to keep that if we can and be mindful of reader response. But don't just be mindful of reader response as if all the readers are bent toward leftist beliefs or non-Christian beliefs in a particular way. There are many different kinds of non-Christians, and a lot of them now, we'll talk about this in chapter 2, let's go. A lot of the non-Christians in the general audience favor cultural conservative virtues and tropes. So let's talk about that. Let's get to know your actual neighbors in chapter 2, but not without stopping by sponsor 2. Squire of Truth by Jill Williamson. Speaking of castles and knights with mixed motives and all of that, Cole has journeyed far from his days as a stray stable boy in a distant mountain village. Haunted by failures on the battlefield, he seeks solace in music. But when the songstress he spent a fleeting evening with shows up at his doorstep, Cole may have gotten more than he asked for. Amidst the turmoil of a looming royal wedding and the threat of dark magic, Cole and Mistel must unravel the mystery of a brutal murder before they become the next targets in a deadly game of power. Return to the world of Eretz in Squire of Truth, a murder mystery romantasy from award-winning author Jill Williamson, and the first installment in the epic Blood of Kings Legends series. Squire of Truth is at Amazon. Squire of Truth is at the Sunrise shop from Sunrise Publishing, and you can see more details and the full cover in the Lorehaven library. Just go to the links for this episode 251 or lorehaven.com/podcast. Chapter 2. What is the actual general audience? I'd start off by saying I think the general audience would really like Squire of Truth. That sounds like it would have mass appeal, even though it doesn't have like signals or detailed spicy scenes or the things that people may think the general audience wants. I think the general audience who actually cares about these things do not want those. I'm going to spoil the ending. I think that now, this could change, but now, for most faithful Christian authors, today's general audience is no longer what we have perceived. A bunch of secular folks, sympathetic toward leftist ideas, who may have bad church experiences, who just need to see Christian love or creative excellence that is better than the Christians of yesteryear. Maybe that was true before, but I don't think that's true now among folks who are paying attention. I think that if authors are trying to be too mindful of the market demand, supposedly, for stories that have people with different sexual identities or identity politics, maybe some sensual content in there, or maybe you need to say something and have a very special episode about racism, I think that those readers are not really going to care as much as you think. I don't think they're going to be tempted by a Christian take on this. I think they're perfectly happy with the books they've got from non-Christian authors. And there's another author shout out here. Guys, I really don't think it's worth it trying to get into a secular publisher. Now, maybe there may be some exceptions that prove the rule. And in that case, Godspeed, you're going to need it. But go where God sends you, into the belly of the beast, and let's see how you do. I don't think, though, that those people, that type of audience, is going to care about a Christian author who comes along and says or acts like, hey, I'm a better, holier, politer Christian. I'm not like those Christians you knew. Chances are that kind of audience really didn't know any Christians very seriously. I'm not like those kinds of Christians. And they're like, okay, so I never went to church, man. Like, it's a lot of people, y'all, that never actually went to church. They're not like you and I. They have never, maybe never seen the inside of a church building, not even when they went over to their great aunts for the weekend. In fact, a lot of folks who are powering the sales for these kinds of, woke type books, a lot of them are very happy on their side of the culture war. So if you come along as a Christian saying, I don't like the culture war, they're probably very happy to affirm you not liking it, but they're perfectly fine participating in it, whether or not they call it that. I think that we are talking about general trends here. There's exceptions, like I said, but there's still this perception, Zach, among Christian creatives, for example. We've talked with them, and again, God bless them, no shade. But we've had guests on this very podcast who have come from the secular creative spaces and said, hey, I cut my teeth in this movie studio, or I cut my teeth on this publisher, or this publisher was going to publish me and it was going to be big. But then they found out that I was a serious Christian, and they cut me loose because it was 2020 or 2019. And they discovered that, oh, I actually do believe that marriage is between a man and a woman biblically defined. So they went, bye. And you could have been the absolute sweetest Mother Teresa, Santa Claus, your favorite Pope type Christian in the world, and they still would have cut you loose. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, y'all. And maybe they were super duper artistically professional and got along great with people who disagreed with them, and yet somehow they still no longer found a place in that space. And they have a lot of frustrations with churches too, by the way, because they're a little differently wired. They've got the creative gifts that God has given them, but now they don't have a home in that secular space. Often they're going independent. Like Zach, you mentioned earlier about it's independent creatives who are on the rise here, either in the podcast space or the publishing space. And not all of them are Christians, but a lot of the Christians who came from that place, they may have had big traditional publishing deals. A lot of them are going independent now, and they're doing very well reaching the actual general audience because of that choice.
Yeah, and I think that's actually such a big component of the vibe shift that we got to emphasize it some more. It's that we are moving into a culture that's no longer defined by top-down structure, but bottom-up, grassroots fandoms. And I have a really good friend in our local writers group who just independently published his first comic book. Now, would you have known about this if all you looked for was what they have on the shelves at certain comic book stores or whatever? Maybe not. But if you follow this guy, like many people do on social media, you'll know it's release day for his comic book. So shout out to Jonathan Bridges in Kleos. I can never pronounce it. Sorry, Jonathan. But that is a huge part of the shift, is that people can get their message out, get their story out without all the gatekeepers that are, like you said, very one-sided in the culture right now. And I should say story, not message, because, Stephen, there used to be this phrase in Hollywood: if you want to send a message, use Western Union. And this was advice given to all aspiring screenwriters who have a message they want to change the world with through a movie.
The message.
And Hollywood has always said no to that kind of thing, that we do not want to do that. We want to entertain people first and foremost. We want to give people a good story and let the message be discovered instead of forced on people. And what's changed over the last couple decades is that Hollywood has totally gone back on that traditional wisdom, and they have tried to force certain messages into so many films. And moviegoers have had enough of it. Video game players have long had enough of it, and that's what started the whole Gamergate thing. And now book readers, we've had enough of that too, and we've said, I just want a good story. And I think what we're seeing now is a return to that, like, where can I find excellent stories? I don't necessarily want a story that affirms my message and my views. I just want a good story. Like, is that too much to ask people? And that's where I want to say address another vibe shift, which is this phrase that's been around for a while: Twitter is not real life. I think that was true I think it's always true in some sense, is that people don't necessarily talk in person the way they talk on Twitter, because it's sort of like my thoughts to your thoughts, like a mind meld happening on Twitter. Like it's not how we speak aloud. So that's true. Also, people don't usually like monologue and, party settings or whatever. It's more of a back and forth. And, now you have these long threads and whatnot. But the other side of that was driving that sentiment was that Twitter was being suppressed. It was being ideologically suppressed. Then 2 years ago now, it came under new ownership. The kind of censorship went away. The AI was retrained or whatever. And so now people can speak more freely. And it showed that there were a lot of conservatives there that were just being quiet. And I think the same is true in a lot of these creative industries, that there have always been conservatively geared people there, but they've just kind of played it safe and played it quiet. But now I think what we're seeing, because of the rise of indie media and indie publishing, people who are more overtly conservative or overtly Christian are creating things and speaking up about it. And, Stephen, honestly, this is sort of the approach I've taken. So I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I work for a Christian ministry. I couldn't hide who I was. There's a lot of people who want to speak up from anonymity for various reasons, and I can understand that. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be some kind of a leader and, hiding behind some pseudonym and some fake identity. I'm just like, I'm going to be myself because it's too exhausting to be someone else. It's exhausting enough just to be myself. And I thought, I'm just going to make that part of what I always talk about. I want to always be overt about being a Christian, and, the fact that I believe in Jesus Christ as my savior. And I don't think any other way is going to save us, and that's the ultimate answer is the gospel, that Jesus died for our sins. He was raised on the third day and he lives today, and he's the way to God. I'm not going to hide those beliefs. And I think a lot of other people are coming to that realization that they don't have to hide who they are. They might not talk about it all the time. They might not talk about it in their fiction. They're like, hey, I just want to write a good, cozy mystery or something. Or I just want to write a good, epic fantasy. But they're not going to shy away from saying who they are. And I think, courage begets courage. It's contagious. And so that's what really gets me excited, Stephen, because I think a lot of authors have really good intentions, and they say, I really just want to bless people with a good story. I want to entertain them and help them, kind of forget their troubles for a little bit. Or I want to go beyond that and like really show something transcendent to people and point them towards a greater reality. Like, and they might kind of stop there and kind of use vague language. But they're like, well, I don't want to lead people by the nose. I don't want to force anything on them. I want to be sensitive. And I can understand that. But I also think, because of internet culture, like nothing that is hidden will remain so. Everything that is hidden will be brought into the light. Like you can't hide on the internet. It doesn't work. Like everything will be exposed on the internet. So you might as well just be upfront about it. You may not want to talk about your faith all the time, like I said, but don't feel like you have to hide it. I think it's fine. People respect authenticity. We said at the beginning of the show, the reason Dave Ramsey is still a very popular person is because he respects his audience, and he's open about who he is, and people respect that. So I think we will see. Look, not everyone's going to love you because you're a Christian. Like Jesus said, to expect people to dislike you, to call you cringe or to reject you. But I think that it's sincerity that is very much valued in our culture right now.
Absolutely. By the way, Zach, we're calling it X now, so don't be like an evangelical who's 5 years behind. It's X now. He's earned the right. It's earned the right to rename itself, and the AI there is actually pretty good too. Yeah, X, Twitter, whatever is not real life, but real life does contain it. Similarly, movies are not real life, but real life contains movies, and movies do shape real life. So There's an old phrase that says, for example, politics is downstream of culture, meaning the jokes, the memes, the beliefs, the stories and songs that people tell are what's going to shape the policies that are enacted by elected leaders or monarchs or whomever. Well, there's a partial truth to that phrase, but also political leaders shape culture. The laws and the beliefs, they go back and forth. It's more of a water cycle, more of an ecosystem. And I think the sooner that Christian fans and creatives pay attention to that, the better. And that way we're keeping up with what real life is actually like. Now, I don't mean, for example, that, people who are, quote, woke, end quote, it was always a sham. It's barely 5% of the population. There's a silent majority. I think the silent majority actually just doesn't really care, and they're distracted with their phones and their bills and some things that make sense. What I mean is that the folks buying books, the folks who are interested in creating new things or enjoying new things being created as opposed to legacy franchises, they are the majority. This is the majority there, rather than the folks that you may have perceived who got beef with the church and you just want to see nicer, more professional Christian-made storytelling. I think that that's a minority, and I think Christian creative, that if you are trying to reach that audience, you're going to increasingly have a bad time because they're not going to pay attention to you unless you compromise, unless you act like them, unless you throw out very deeply biblical beliefs about what marriage is, what men and women are, and then ultimately who God is. I don't think you want to go down that route. It's bad for your soul as well as being bad for your creativity, because if we had a numbers guy in here like Thomas Imstad, he could tell you these stories do not sell. They do not sell. This is not just speculation about people's motives. It is cold, hard numbers. Take a recent example, the Disney Star Wars TV show, The Acolyte. That did not sell.
Oh, it bombed.
It bombed. It was humiliating. Now, it was poorly made by a lot of accounts. It had a lot of creative issues with it. But very clearly, its creator found that Western Union had gone out of business and she would rather send a message over Disney Plus. So she did, and people didn't like it.
And I think there's a one-to-one here. When you prioritize some kind of activism instead of excellence and creativity.
This goes for Christians too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one or the other. You can't have both. You can't have you can't serve two masters.
You cannot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this show too affected popular culture because the majority of popular culture, the general audience rejected this show. The general audience is, well, let's get to know the general audience 2.0. Okay. Let's get to know these new neighbors. And what'll be the timestamp for this episode, you think, Zach? Maybe 50 minutes in? Okay. Bookmark this, y'all. Bookmark the 50-minute mark or whatever it ends up being. And we will go into overtime for this episode, but we'll try to keep it succinct. What is today's general audience who might be interested in Christian-made stories, maybe even overt ones, because they don't hate Christians like you think they did? It looks very different. They are not closed, but open to public expressions of Christianity. There was a Christian apologist named Wesley Hull who was on the top podcast in the world, the Joe Rogan Experience. Not a Christian podcast, but here's someone open to public expressions of Christianity, the gospel, very kind yet firm challenges to his beliefs, apologetics, textual criticism. Wesley Hull was all over it. And then Mel Gibson was on there. Now, Mel Gibson's a little rough around the edges, but he had a fantastic quote about the resurrection I can't repeat on a family podcast.
Bless his heart.
Bless his heart. Yeah. But I think Mel Gibson might go to heaven and then he'll just need a lot of sanctification, but don't we all? The general audience now tends to be friendly toward cultural conservatism, or at least they are anti-woke. They are powering these YouTube channels that are roasting the Acolyte and the Rings of Power and the Snow White live action animated remake and all these things. Like they are the majority. If you go to the teaser for the last Snow White video, everyone's wanting the evil queen Gal Gadot to win. And it's being downvoted like crazy. Like, guys, this stuff doesn't work, at least not at the movies. Maybe you can make it work with the books, but I don't think it's going to work much there either. That means these people do dislike movies, games, and shows that come across to them as woke. There's that catch-all term. And what does woke include? Well, some of these people do sound kind of racist, but a lot of them are not. But they don't like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a particular view of social policy I won't get into here, but they don't like that. They don't like other ideas.
I'll get into it. It's very simple. It's okay. Favoritism. It's
Oh, it is, yeah.
favoritism rather than meritocracy. That's it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that, at least in principle, defy the idea that we want excellently made storytelling. The general audience doesn't really watch a whole lot of TV shows. They certainly are, cable cutters. They control the TV. They'll watch it on phone. They'll watch it on streaming. I don't know exactly what kinds of books they're reading, but I'm guessing there's a lot of digital books there, and I'm guessing a lot of them are reading books they hear about on podcasts. Because as Zach mentioned earlier, podcasts are huge right now. Absolutely enormous. The general audience often perceives that their enemies are among the secular leftist folks more than Christians. So they're not out there with a chip on their shoulder about how the church done them wrong so much as they are the government did me wrong. And the government needs to be changed and the government needs to be overhauled. That's how they perceive things. Most of them, as Zach mentioned earlier, voted with the majority in the recent U.S. elections. Now, I heard the stat earlier. What is it like? Probably majority of citizens in the U.S. didn't vote. Well, then they're silent. They've abdicated their role. Maybe they're secretly leftists all the time, but they didn't show up. And the general audience who's actually involved in these things did show up. And these folks are feeling more optimistic about the vibe shift in the United States. They're the reason for it. And it's not just in the US. There's some global cultural movements across the world in other nations that have gone on to this. I saw the president of Argentina at a conservative conference last week. By the way, we put a few links in the show notes about the vibe shift. There's a Substack article by Santiago Pliego and also the guy from the Free Press called Niall Ferguson. What does this mean if you want to go a little deeper in that? Most important for us, though, these folks do tend to be fans of fantastical stories, and they do not want agenda. They do not want woke or what they think is woke in there. And a lot of them are young men, and they're interested in philosophy and long-form discussions like podcasts. A lot of them are very online. They're gamer bros. They're on X. They're on other social media. They're testing the limits of free speech. They're doing a lot of trolling. They're sharing memes, some offensive. I'll talk about that in the next chapter. And some just trying to test the limits there. They are readers. They are board gamers. Some of them make their own board game. They are video gamers. They're content creators. Most of them are independent. Most important for us here, though, they don't have, as I mentioned, they don't have any stigma about Christian fiction. They're not going to recoil necessarily. In fact, they might pay a little bit closer attention if they find out that you're a Christian making a really great story, whether or not it's overtly Christian in content. By the way, I'd like to say that we at Lorehaven have been gearing toward, in part, this general audience, but not just them, because you get into trouble if you narrow too much. We have four main audiences at lorehaven.com and this podcast. The first is Christian fans who are individuals who enjoy these stories, most of them from Christian families, Christian backgrounds. They grew up in church. And a lot of them also like to make these kinds of fantastical stories. Group two is homeschool families. Enough said, but they're groups of people, they're clans. They train their kids to love reading books. They go to conferences. They buy books by the stack. Can't wait to see them again. The conferences I'll attend this May. Church influencers is group three. These are evangelical leaders who are not closed to fantastical fiction. A lot of them are very pop culture savvy, or they would like to be. And then group four is what I would call this kind of general audience, cultural conservatives. Generally, these are non-Christians, because conservative doesn't mean Christian, and they're open to biblical virtues. I don't mean they're Christians. I don't mean that they believe in Jesus. They may say some really nice things about Jesus, but ultimately reject him. But they do like what Jesus did for society. We'll talk about that more in chapter 3. This is the vibe shift here.
Yeah, I think there's another undercurrent beneath all of that, which is that these are people that believe masculinity is good. They've rejected the corporate mainstream, message of toxic masculinity, and they've said that that's silly. They believe in manhood and the virtues of manhood. People have said, you know what, being a man is good. God made manhood. If you're a Christian, you're going to take it further, right? You're going to say God made man and women, and he called it good. And so, yes, we're all affected by sin. Like, we have sin from our birth, and it does skew our masculinity or our femininity. But at the core of it, there is something very good about being a man or being a woman. And I think what a lot of people have realized is that our very nature has been under assault, and it's being redefined. Not just men, but women too. Lots of just common sense people are saying no to this, and they're saying no to stories that incorporate these ideas and that are pushing these ideas. And so, yeah, a lot of people who aren't even joining this cause from a Christian worldview are realizing that the Christians have had the right idea all along. It's like, yeah, this is like literally from the first chapter of the Bible that we've believed in what a man and a woman is.
Yeah, and they're saying yes to stories, not just that are pushing cultural conservative ideas, but that are simply staying out of it, that are
Yeah.
not pushing the opposite ideas, that are just playing it straight down the middle. So if you're an author who just wants to stay out of the culture wars, like it stresses you out, or maybe you're not called to these things, just play it straight down the middle. And you will, I believe, if you're good at it, and if you're being faithful to the gifts God has given you, faithful to Him, you're going to find an audience. You really will. Just be aware that that is the general audience that I think you've been looking for. Well, let's go to a story that I think will have some general audience appeal as well as appeal to Christian readers. And that is author Josiah DeGraff. He's actually the on-screen editor at Lorehaven, who's doing a Kickstarter for his first fantasy novel, A Study of Shattered Spells. You've read magic school novels before, but have you ever wondered what it would be like to teach at one of these memorable academies? This month, Josiah DeGraff launches A Study of Shattered Spells on Kickstarter. It's going on right now through this Friday, February the 28th. So as of this episode's release, you only have a few days to support this Kickstarter. It contains everything, this book, that happens at Magic School, which you haven't seen before. Behind the scenes politics between teachers and principals, teachers wrestling over how to notice and stop bullies, the conversations teachers only have when students aren't around. If you're looking for dark academia vibes, but without the R-rated content, or if you like music-based magic systems, or if you just love fantasy novels with interior illustrations, you won't want to miss this campaign running from February 11th through this Friday, February 28th, for your chance to get the exclusive special edition, a personalized Magic School acceptance letter, and more. Go to a studyofshatteredspells.com to back this Kickstarter. Let's check the numbers now and see how Josiah is doing. Study of Shattered Spells as of Saturday, February 22nd is, oh my goodness, thank the Lord. Look at this. He's got $17,460 here. That is spectacular, and he is offering some spectacular swag. So a studyofshatteredspells.com to back that Kickstarter. We are now in overtime, but it's worth it because we need to close with chapter 3. What are the pros and cons of the vibe shift? Lest Zach and I seem too optimistic, there's a little cynic in both of us. Maybe it's because we write science fiction where characters face a lot of tough choices. Maybe it's because we've been at this business a while and we're getting disillusioned. But hey, we love stories that are either playing it straight down the middle and not going for this revision of human nature nonsense. And we love stories that extol things like male and female courage, and even better if they're playing out the gospel in imaginary worlds. We love those kinds of stories. All right, we stay positive here. So we'll lead with the positive, with the pros of this vibe shift toward cultural conservatism or anti-wokeism or whatever you call it. Then we're going to finish with some cautions, because now that some of the stress is off from a particular kind of bad guys, I'm starting to see a different kind of bad guy arising. And a lot of people have seen only that, and they're not paying attention to what's provoking it. So you really can't pay attention to those observers, but there are some issues here. And it's something I want to be aware of, and I want to temper any optimism about this vibe shift. But first, let's talk about the advantage, especially for Christian fans and creators of fantastical fiction. The top one I've already mentioned 2 or 3 times. These readers don't have stigmas about Christian-made stories that are wholesome or clean or upholding traditional moral values. They don't have a chip on their shoulder about churches. In fact, many of them are feeling drawn back to church, or they're at least theoretically supportive of the church. Elon Musk, he has many issues. He's basically a polygamist, you guys. He's got lots of issues. He's a secular humanist, but he has called himself a cultural Christian. So has wasn't he one of the 4 horsemen, Richard Dawkins? Weren't we supposed to hate that guy? Richard Dawkins is out there saying, I really have a thing for Christmas carols, and I wouldn't want to see the cathedrals go away. I guess that makes me a cultural Christian. Like, well, Richard Dawkins, you're going to be appreciating those hymns and cultural Christianity on your way down to hell. Repent and receive Jesus Christ to be born again. But I like it that you don't hate our Christian stuff.
Yeah, Stephen, another big figure on the cultural right is Jordan Peterson, who, you and I went to one of his events years ago, and it was really interesting.
He rambled a bit, actually. I think. Yeah. I don't remember what he said. Guess I'm not smart.
Well, what I remember the most from that event was standing in line behind this guy who just opened up and told us that Jordan Peterson saved his life.
Oh, that's right.
And I was like, well, what does that mean? And basically, he didn't go into specifics, but this gentleman was telling us that his life was just a big mess before he started reading Jordan Peterson. And it was like a conversion story, but it wasn't like a conversion to Christianity, but just a different, more healthier way of living. But it wasn't like a religious or a spiritual kind of thing. And I think that's the sort of double-edged sword of some of this stuff. The Babylon Bee had a great headline that illustrated this, which was, Jordan Peterson considers every possible meaning of Bible story, except that it might mean exactly what it says.
Yeah. I mean, in one way, Jordan Peterson is almost like a classic theological liberal. Yeah. Not that he's a pastor or something like that, but he has become somewhat of a spiritual guru. And my favorite line with Jordan Peterson is actually borrowed from Red Skull in Avengers Endgame, where he says, I guide others to a treasure I cannot possess. Well, he needs to possess that treasure, and the treasure is Jesus, and it's worth selling everything to buy the field with the treasure in it. So, Dr. Peterson, come on down. There's room for many at the Jordan. The Jordan, get it? Yeah. I just kind of fell into that metaphorical river. He doesn't believe in Jesus. But Jordan Peterson and others, these cultural conservatives, are leading people to recognize that Christianity has great benefits to culture and institutions. And the people who are following after this are basically getting a hold, not of the gospel, but of something very like God's moral law. So, there's dangers there. It's a starting. Well,
don't end there.
Don't end there. Exactly. Now, it's better to get a hold of God's moral law than to be lawless. But there are certainly some risks, because if you stop there, then you could be made twice the son of hell as anyone else. And that's why Jesus warned so much about obsessing over, quote, the law, in quote, so much that you start making up laws and feeling like a pretty cool human being on your own so that you do not need a savior. So I'm crossing over with the hazards. Let's focus on the positive now. While they're delighting in stories that are reflecting the moral law, they're going after these wholesome stories. They like these books, or else they want to like these books, which is often close enough. And as I've said, they listen to long-form podcasts that generally challenge materialism and godlessness and lawlessness. And they're interested in boundaries. They're interested in tradition, these types of readers, these types of fans. For example, like already I've talked to a few non-Christians who are interested in Above the Circle of Earth. Now, this is a story about Christian missionaries trying to go to space, fighting a humanist technocracy, hence plenty of issues in their Christian homeworld. A lot of the potential readers for these stories may not be Christian, or maybe they kind of sound like Christians. Maybe they're pre-Christian. Maybe they're seeking. If that's true of a more overt story, if I've gotten even a little bit of interest in that from people who don't seem to be full-on Christians themselves, how much more so would these folks be interested in stories that don't have overt Christian characters or content, but that are still made by a thoughtful Christian with excellence, reflecting the basics of God's good and virtuous moral law? How much will these folks love these kinds of stories, if nothing else, because they're different from how they perceive the woke media and the identity politics and all this stuff that really brings on a kind of lawlessness?
I think we should talk about some dangers too. So, the main danger I want to focus on is sort of the danger to us that are in the church. So, one danger is that we can think because of this vibe shift, we are now the stars of the show and we're the heroes now of culture.
Oh yeah, our ships come in. Jesus has basically returned, and no, don't do that.
And I've just made my peace with the fact that a lot of people probably see me like Ned Flanders, like how Homer saw Ned Flanders, like, oh, just kind of a lovable but sort of annoying neighbor, but he's kind of harmless, but he kind of like rubs me the wrong way, but I don't hate him. But what a goofball, like that. That's how Ned Flanders was. And I think we're just kind of seeing a return to that of like sort of the 90s attitude towards Christians of like, okay, we'll kind of put up with these guys. But the other danger I think that we can see is, we've talked about culture warring, which I think honestly, a lot of things get perceived or maligned as culture warring when it's just simply saying no to cultural trends and just saying, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm not going to say that, shibboleth that you want me to say to get along with everyone. I'm not going to do your land acknowledgement. I'm not going to put pronouns on things. Like, I'm just not going to take part in that. That's not culture warring. What's culture warring is when people force you to do those things. But I think that it can become a danger to get so focused on this that it's all you want to do is just fight people who do this. And that's why I think a lot about Revelation 2, the letter to Ephesus, where Jesus says, I know your works, your labor, your endurance. You cannot tolerate evil people. You've tested those who call themselves apostles and are not. You've found them to be liars. I know you've persevered and endured hardships for the sake of my name, and you've not grown weary. So look, a lot of Christians are in this place where they're like, I've been trying to get this garbage out of my kids' school or my workplace or my neighborhood or my knitting organization or whatever it is. And we're like, just sick of all this stuff. And I haven't given into it. Isn't that great? Okay. But then verse 4, Jesus says, but I have this against you. You have abandoned the love you had at first. So that's terrifying, is that you can get so focused on these sort of cultural issues that you forget about love for Christ. And look, I think it really comes down to how often are you reading the Bible? How often are you just praying to the Lord in your own time? I'm looking in the mirror when I ask this question, okay? But that's sort of the danger, is that we can get focused on these worldly things and just forget our love for Christ.
That is so appropriate, a reminder, especially as it regards our own souls. I think sometimes people feel so unselfish and they're focusing on, well, I need to save the world. I need to influence the world. People need Jesus, and all of that is true. But if we're doing that in this kind of endless culture war mindset, and that's even more of a danger if someone is actually earning a living at this, then you really deep down don't want the war to end, because then you wouldn't know what to do with yourself. You would not know what to do in the peace. And there's all kinds of stories, true and fictional, about men who came home from the Great War and they just brought the war back with them. They were so well trained for the war and they survived so many terrible things, and they saw, many terrible things around them that now they don't know how not to fight. This is a terrible thing that's happened to their souls. It's not just post-traumatic stress. They're just conditioned for the battle. And that is not what the Christian life is for. The fight, even to be sanctified, to become like Jesus, will eventually be fulfilled. And we will be like him. And by then, I think this gives rise to the myth that we're just going to be bored in heaven because there's nothing more to do. Well, that's not true. You need to be fighting when you are fighting, however you're fighting, for the peace. Because if you're not fighting for that future paradise where the glory of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea, then you're not Christianing very well. And even, by the way, cultural conservative pundits worth their salt. Some of them are Christians, some of them are not. They know this. I was watching a Daily Wire, a backstage event last week. Told y'all I keep up with this stuff, even if I don't talk about it here. And it was Jeremy Boring, who's actually making a Pendragon Cycle streaming series based on the Stephen Lawhead Christian-made fantasy. So he's got his foot in that door. Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, and Andrew Klavan, they were asked the question, okay, what do we do now when we seem to have some of the political stresses taken off us? And to a man, in different ways, they agreed, you got to build something. It's no use fighting, for example, for free speech if you're now not going to practice good free speech, if you're not going to use your rights to raise a family, go to church, become a better person. And of course, they're speaking very ecumenically, but a Christian perspective would be dig into the gospel, build your house on a firm foundation, which is Christ, and not, the shifting sands of the culture war. It gets a little swampy out there. But I'm not one of those Christians who says, don't fight in the culture war. Everybody just needs a bit of peace. Sometimes you need these conflicts, guys. It's a sinful, groaning world, okay? That's part of engaging the culture. But cultural engagement is temporary. If you get stuck in it, then you're not going to do it right. So that's a big threat.
Yeah, and I think there's another threat of, like you said, that not leaving the war behind is that turning disagreeableness into sort of an epistemology. Like, the way to truth is to find out what the elites don't want you to know and what you're not supposed to talk about. And boy, there are some crazy things that can happen from the right end of the spectrum, and suspecting that there's a Jew around every corner trying to corrupt society.
Terrible. Anti-Semitism has got to stop. Yeah,
it's ridiculous, and it's lazy. Look, for my part, I've been tuning out of a lot of these political things and Daily Wire stuff, Timcast, other things I've been listening to, and I'm like, I think I'm going to watch some TV shows that have been in my queue for several years, or play a video game that came out 10 years ago that I've thought about for a long time, or just work on my own, books and other things I'm creating. Because as you said, what is the point of all of this? Like, what is the point for fighting for these freedoms if we're not going to use them and create things? And I think that's, we've been in like react mode for so long as a culture, and like, what new crazy thing is going to happen today? And it's like, okay, there are other crazy things that are happening in culture coming from other sides of the culture that we got to be aware of. I mean, we need to probably do a whole new episode about AI, because there were like a million new AI things this week, right? And so,
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, right. And so that's a whole other thing that we don't want to follow culture in these things. We want to lead culture as the church.
Well, Zach and I have also done an episode or two about deconstruction. And that's the impulse we're talking about here, to tear things down. And this is specifically condemned by a walking, talking tree named Treebeard, an ent who says of Saruman that he has a mind of metal and wheels, and he no longer cares for growing things. And what a terrible place to be, where you cannot think about building new things and delighting in the goodness of nature and all of God's gifts. You just want to tear everything apart because the bad guys have ruined it so much. And we see this among this new general audience when you see the hatred of good institutions like marriage or even God-given humanity. Like, do not sit on your high horse and yell at the woke for corrupting definitions of manhood and womanhood when you are a raging misogynist who hates marriage or thinks that men are awesome and we just need to get a bunch of people pregnant, and who really wants to stick with one woman. Some of that is just trolling, but it is nasty. It's just as anti-biblical. And so that's the kind of things, Christian fan or creator, that you're going to meet if you are getting involved with this audience. These are the hazards that you're going to encounter, along with the usual stuff that you've probably been taught to expect, like racism or the anti-Semitism that Zach mentioned. I think that there's a real strain among some well-meaning Christians to be seeker-friendly. And in the past, we've tried to be seeker-friendly about people we thought had bad issues with the church. So we needed to be a kinder, gentler church. Well, now we have a different seeker-friendly temptation. Okay, now the majority wants us to be mean and own the libs and all of this stuff. And there's some need for that, but if you make that your whole shtick, then that's just as bad as the previous seeker-friendly shtick. You're being steered by what you think the people want, rather than a desire to be like Jesus and please him through your evangelism, through your creativity, through all of your callings and ministry. These people who reject bad institutions, or they think are corrupt institutions like marriage and all this stuff, and they're getting into the worst kinds of nationalism and all that. I don't think they know what marriage is for. I don't think they know what stories are for, what nations are for. Scripture gives us these answers. Here's what a nation could be for. Here's what culture making is for. Here's what marriage is for. The Christian can go to the Bible if you're in teaching mode and teach this. Or if you're a storyteller, you can show these good things. You don't need to propagandize. Just show in your stories what these things are for, why they're good. And that is powerful. Imagination, as we heard about with Daniel Schwalbauer in episode 250 just a week ago, imagination cuts through the boundaries that people put up for logical argument. If you show them a picture, that can sometimes shine a very narrow laser beam through the darkness. And the Holy Spirit, I think, can use that to awaken them to the darkness that's in themselves, especially if they're in hatred mode or deconstructive mode all the time. And then they will find Jesus, which ought to be the point of our stories, whether or not they are overt. And as Zach mentioned earlier, no matter who seems to be the majority in culture, no matter where the vibe is shifting, our chief end as Christians is not to please sinful humans, but to glorify God and enjoy Him forever.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, have you seen or felt this vibe shift? Where have you seen it? Have you seen a book or a movie or a video game particularly, sort of reject the prevailing culture of the last couple of years and just return to something more traditional, even something more Christian or a positive portrayal of Christianity? We want to know these kinds of stories. So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com or find us on X, Facebook, or Instagram. And Stephen, I understand we've got a prize wheel winner here, so let me get the wheel ready to go. And what are we giving away today?
This is our giveaway from last week when we said that Daniel Schwalbauer would give away a signed copy of his book, Nonfiction About Fiction, called The God of Story. We had a lot of entries for this one, so we've got that wheel ready. We're going to pick a very blessed winner here. There's no letters on a board for this one. It's just a simple wheel that has now landed. Oh, just crossed over to @ReedBrucey on Instagram. Congratulations, @ReedBrucey. Thank you for sharing that podcast episode, getting the word out about Lorehaven and its podcast. We will get in touch with Daniel and you and get you that physical copy forthwith for The God of Story by Daniel Schwalbauer. We'll read some more Comm Station notes next week. Next on Fantastical Truth, the fight for the space mission begins in his homeworld. Brock Rivers never wanted to be a repairman on Mars. Years ago, he failed to protect his family, and now he labors across a frontier planet to keep his children alive and escape Cause. Now he is summoned back to Earth for an impossible dream: to resist Cause, confront the secret adversaries among his own people, and to restore gospel missions in the 22nd century above the circle of Earth. Just in time for release day, we're going to explore this story. Vibe shifts, going to build on those ideas and talk more about what will hopefully be a fantastical science fiction adventure authored by yours truly. If you felt the vibe shift, great. Enjoy it while it lasts. It's wonderful when people turn from lawlessness and get interested in moral law. It's a step forward, but do not stop there. If you've got friends who are tempted to stop there, please don't let them. Urge them onward. Introduce them to Jesus through specific overt conversations about our Savior, or through stories, fantastic Christian-made stories that extol Him and help us to keep seeking and finding His fantastical truth.